On the evening of 12th of May, 1938, in the gilded drawing room of 14 Prince's Gate, the American Embassy in London, 18-year-old Kathleen Kick Kennedy sits at a small writing table, a silver vase of roses pushed just out of the way of her elbow. The family has just returned from Queen Charlotte's ball, where the London press will soon call her the debutante of 1938, the most exciting newcomer of the season. Now, while the embassy's crystal chandeliers burn low and carriage wheels fade along Hyde Park, she bends over thick cream notepaper, drafting thank you notes to duchesses and hostesses. Her mother, Rose Kennedy, has drilled the form. Correct salutation, precise compliments, no hint of opinion, kick pauses, tapping her pen, then adds an extra, unrequired line of warmth to one letter, a sly joke to another. In the quiet, the scratch of ink sounds almost defiant. These notes will travel back into the same houses that judged her gown and curtsy. None will mention that, tonight, she felt more alive than obedient. On 20th of February 1920, in the comfortable brick house at 83 Beale Street, Brookline, Massachusetts, Kathleen Agnes Kennedy arrived as the fourth child of 9 to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., already building wealth through banking and business, and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, daughter of Boston's legendary mayor, John Honey Fitzgerald. The Brookline house, modest by the standards Joseph would later achieve, sits in a respectable Irish Catholic neighborhood where professional families balance American ambition against the social hierarchies that still favor Protestant Boston Brahmins. The Kennedy household operates on principles of competition and loyalty that will define Kick's entire life. Joseph, restless and driven, believes in winning above all else. Rose, devout and disciplined, believes in appearances, duty, and the church. Between these poles, 9 children grow up learning that excellence is expected, that Kennedys do not lose, and that every public action reflects on the family's collective reputation. Summers, the family migrates to the shingled compound at Hyannisport on Cape Cod, where Joseph purchases property that becomes the clan's emotional headquarters. The Kennedy children race sailboats, play touch football with ferocious intensity, and compete in swimming races timed by their father with a stopwatch. Joe divides them into teams, keeps score, rewards winners, and makes losing seem like moral failure. The atmosphere, remembered by siblings in various memoirs, combines genuine affection with relentless pressure to perform. From early childhood, Kick distinguishes herself through personality rather than physical prowess. She is lively, quick with jokes, unafraid to argue with her brothers Joe Jr. and Jack, whose intellectual sparring she matches with wit rather than political theory. Family reminiscences collected in biographies and documentary accounts recall her as Joe Sr.'s favorite, the daughter he described as especially special, a remark preserved in later interviews and frequently quoted in profiles of the Kennedy family. The favoritism matters. In a family where attention must be competed for among 9 siblings, being singled out by the patriarch provides both privilege and burden. Joe's approval means access to resources, permission to travel, and a certain latitude in behavior that other Kennedy children might not receive. But it also means heightened expectations, the pressure to justify the special treatment, and the complicated awareness that love in the Kennedy household is often conditional on performance. Rose, steeped in Catholic Boston etiquette and conscious that Irish wealth does not automatically confer social acceptance, insists that each child write formal thank you notes after visits, gifts, or hospitality. At the kitchen table in Bronxville, New York, where the family moves when Kick is 10 and she attends Riverdale Country School, she practices handwriting under her mother's watchful eye, smoothing paper, correcting flourishes, learning the formulas that govern polite society. The lessons are explicit. Gratitude must be expressed promptly, correctly, and beautifully. A thank you note delayed is an insult. One poorly written reflects badly on the entire family. Rose checks each child's correspondence, correcting grammar, critiquing phrasing, ensuring that Kennedy manners match Kennedy money. The ritual, tedious to children, serves multiple purposes. It teaches discipline, refines communication skills, and inscribes in each Kennedy the understanding that they are always performing, always representing something larger than themselves. The letters teach two lessons at once: that charm can be crafted through careful attention to form and detail, and that a Kennedy never leaves a social debt unpaid. Every gift, every invitation, every kindness must be acknowledged, recorded, reciprocated. The economy of obligation, made visible through correspondence, trains Kick in the mechanics of social power. She learns that relationships require maintenance, that influence depends on attention to small courtesies, that the ability to write a gracious note is a form of currency as valuable as money or connections. But the ritual also plants something else: the understanding that words on paper can create space between expectation and desire, that careful phrasing can say one thing while meaning another, that the form itself, so rigid, so prescribed, can be subtly subverted by someone skilled enough to manipulate its conventions. The girl whose pen now records gratitude for borrowed bicycles and picnic games will one day use the same ritual to negotiate love, war, and exile, discovering that the language of politeness can also express the most profound forms of defiance. In early 1938, when Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Joseph P. Kennedy as United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James's, the family crossed the Atlantic with a sense of arrival that transcends mere diplomatic posting. For Joe, the ambassadorship represents the pinnacle of Irish Catholic achievement in America, the ultimate validation of his wealth and influence. For Rose, it offers entry into European society that Boston's Protestant elite had never fully granted. For Kick, 18 and restless, it means London, a city of possibilities that Massachusetts could never provide. The family settles into 14 Prince's Gate, the imposing embassy residence overlooking Hyde Park. The building, with its Georgian symmetry and diplomatic gravitas, becomes a stage for elaborate entertaining. Joe hosts dinners for British politicians and American businessmen. Rose manages the household with the precision she brings to all domestic matters. The Kennedy children, particularly the older ones, find themselves suddenly elevated to a social stratum far beyond anything they knew in America. Kick enrolls at Queen's College, London, a progressive institution focused on women's education. She walks past Georgian terraces to classes in literature and history, carrying leather satchels and wearing the modest clothing appropriate to a young woman of her position. The academic work interests her. She's bright and curious. But the real education happens outside classrooms, in the intricate social world of London's upper classes that now opens to the American ambassador's daughter. That spring, she was presented at Queen Charlotte's Ball, the annual debutante event where young women from Britain's elite families make their formal entrance into society. The ritual, unchanged for generations, requires white dress, formal courtesy, and careful attention to precedent and protocol. Kick, American and Catholic, occupies an unusual position, prestigious enough through her father's office to merit invitation, but marked by nationality and religion as permanently outside the system she's entering. London's social press calls her the most exciting debutante of 1938, an American brightness amid titled names. The coverage, preserved in newspaper archives and quoted in biographies, notes her vivacity, her humor, her refusal to adopt the studied boredom that marks some British debutantes. She laughs too loudly, dances too enthusiastically, treats aristocrats with an American directness that Europeans find alternately charming and shocking. Society columns note her quick wit at garden parties in Hyde Park and at race meetings at Goodwood, Ascot, and other venues of the season. Photographers capture her laughing, hat slightly askew, the formal perfection of her dress contrasting with the spontaneity of her expression. The images, reproduced in British and American papers, show someone comfortable in her own skin, at ease in circumstances that might intimidate others, genuinely enjoying the privilege that her father's position has conferred. In letters home, preserved at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, she describes the thrill of dancing at E.O. Lancaster House, the Baroque state rooms lit by thousands of candles, the orchestra playing waltzes that seem to come from another century. She writes about the strange solemnity of curtsying before royalty, the physical discipline required to descend and rise gracefully in elaborate dress. the awareness that hundreds of eyes assess every movement. She mentions with amusement English girls' reaction to her nickname Kick, so American, so informal, so impossible to reconcile with the formal Lady Kathleen, that some hope she'll adopt if she marries into the aristocracy. Yet beneath the glamour sits the first architecture of expectation. To be both an American advertisement and a flawless Catholic daughter, Joe wants his children, particularly his daughters, to embody American vitality and confidence, to show British society that Irish Catholics can match or exceed Protestant standards. Rose wants her children, particularly her daughters, to remain devout, to marry within the faith, to uphold the religious principles that define Kennedy identity. The contradiction, not yet fully visible, will shape everything that follows. Kick is supposed to be charming enough to attract aristocratic attention, but Catholic enough to reject Protestant suitors. She is supposed to enjoy London society but not prefer it to American values. She is supposed to represent Kennedy excellence, but always remember that excellence serves family ambition, not personal desire. The letters she writes home during this period, carefully preserved and occasionally quoted in family biographies, show someone beginning to understand the impossible position she occupies. She is enthusiastic about England, but not too enthusiastic. She mentions young men, but not too specifically. She describes social triumphs, but frames them as reflecting well on her parents and America, rather than as personal achievements. The careful calibration of tone, the strategic omissions, the subtle management of information, these skills, learned in childhood correspondence lessons, now serve in navigating between family expectation and personal experience. Even as newspapers celebrate her as a London sensation, the question at home is not whom she will become, but whom she will be allowed to marry. The phrasing matters, not whom she will choose, but whom she will be allowed. The passive construction acknowledging that her choice, however heartfelt, must ultimately receive parental approval and church sanction. For Rose particularly, marriage is not a matter of personal preference, but of theological correctness, social suitability, and family strategy. Love, in this framework, is acceptable only when properly constrained by duty. On a bright July afternoon in 1938, at a garden party somewhere in the manicured English countryside, accounts vary on the exact location, some suggesting it was in London's aristocratic districts, others placing it in a country estate. Kick meets William Billy, Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, heir to the 10th Duke of Devonshire, and to Chatsworth, one of England's most magnificent estates. The encounter, seemingly casual, will determine the rest of her short life. Billy Cavendish, born in 1917, represents everything the British aristocracy values: ancient lineage, vast landholdings, impeccable education at Eton and Cambridge, and the quiet confidence that comes from never having to prove one's importance. He is tall, reserved, courteous, what the English call a proper gentleman. His family, the Cavendishes, have been central to British political and social life for centuries. Chatsworth, the family seat in Derbyshire, houses priceless art collections and employs hundreds of servants. To marry the future Duke of Devonshire is to enter the highest level of British society, to become part of an institution that predates nations. For Kick, Billy represents something else as well: genuine connection, intellectual companionship, and the first serious romance of her life. Accounts from family, friends, and later biographers describe a courteous, reserved young officer drawn to her irreverent grin, her American directness, her refusal to be intimidated by his title or position. She makes him laugh. He steadies her exuberance with British restraint. The attraction, while grounded in physical chemistry, seems also based on complementary temperaments. She brings energy and spontaneity. He provides stability and depth. Their names begin to appear together in society gossip columns, at regattas on the Thames, at Ascot races where aristocrats gather in formal dress to see and be seen, at dinners where ambassadors and dukes share tables and discuss the deteriorating European political situation. The press attention, while flattering, also makes their relationship public in ways that complicate private feelings. They cannot simply date. they must perform dating for audiences that interpret every public appearance as evidence of serious courtship intent. In private, she writes longer letters home, pages where enthusiasm for England leaks through the polite formulas Rose expects. One line in a surviving letter from this period mentions the nicest Englishman you could imagine, careful phrasing that conveys affection without naming names, enthusiasm without specificity. The omission of Billy's name and title is strategic. Kick already understands that her mother will object to an Anglican suitor. That full disclosure will prompt immediate intervention. That vagueness preserves freedom. But Rose is not easily deceived. She hears gossip from other Americans in London, reads society columns, asks pointed questions in her own letters. She begins to worry, not just about Billy specifically, but about the entire environment her daughter inhabits. London society, brilliant and seductive, poses spiritual dangers to a Catholic girl. British aristocrats, charming and eligible, represent marriage prospects that would violate. Church teaching. The season, with its dances and parties, creates opportunities for unsuitable attachments. By September 1939, as Germany invades Poland and Britain declares war, the romantic interlude ends abruptly. The embassy prepares to close or at least reduce operations as American diplomats assess whether war will spread. Joe, never comfortable with British foreign policy and increasingly skeptical about American involvement in European conflicts, insists the family return to America. The decision is practical. London will be dangerous, embassy functions will be limited, but it also reflects Joe's discomfort with how thoroughly his children, particularly Kick, have embraced English life. Kick argues to stay, proposing that she could remain with friends in the countryside, away from London's anticipated bombing, but still in England. She writes passionate letters to both parents, making cases based on friendship obligations, educational opportunities, and her work potential with relief organizations. The arguments are sophisticated, well-reasoned, emotionally compelling, and completely ineffective. Joe's decision is final. Ship's passenger lists record her sailing home that autumn, one more American fleeing Europe's gathering storm. The return to America, presented in some accounts as merely practical wartime precaution, actually represents the first major conflict between Kick's desires and family authority. She loses. She is told that obedience is expected, that Kennedy children do not defy parental decisions, that returning to America is not negotiable. The crossing, several days aboard a passenger liner, moving through North Atlantic waters that will soon be U-boat hunting grounds, provides time to process the loss. England is behind her. America, never quite home since London, lies ahead. Billy remains in England, preparing for military service. Their relationship, so promising just months earlier, now faces indefinite separation complicated by war, distance, and family opposition she has barely begun to confront. Refinement has taught her how to ask beautifully, the polite phrasing, the compelling arguments, the dutiful tone, and how it feels when charm cannot alter the decision already made. The lesson is bitter but necessary. Grace and eloquence, powerful tools in many situations, mean nothing when confronting absolute parental authority backed by financial control. She can write the most perfect letter imaginable, making the most reasonable case, and still lose if her father has decided otherwise. The first time she is forced to leave England, she's still certain she will find a way back. The certainty, preserved in letters to friends and in later reminiscences, reflects both her optimism and her naivete. She believes that time, circumstance, or persuasion will eventually align to allow her return. She does not yet understand how thoroughly war will transform everything, how many years will pass before she sees England again, or how much she will have to sacrifice to reclaim what she has lost. Before London's ballrooms and embassy dinners, before the sophisticated navigation of aristocratic courtship, there were convent corridors and chapel bells. In the mid-1930s, when Kick was in her early teens, she spent a year at the Holy Child Convent in Neuilly, France, a suburb of Paris where wealthy Catholic families send daughters for European Polish and religious formation. Later, she attended the Norriton Convent of the Sacred Heart in Connecticut, part of a network of elite Catholic girls' schools that educate the daughters of Irish Catholic wealth across America and Europe. The Sacred Heart System, founded in France and transplanted to America in the 19th century, serves a specific population. Families like the Kennedys, nouveau riche Catholics who have made fortunes but remain outside Protestant social structures, who need their daughters educated to standards matching their wealth while ensuring religious orthodoxy. The schools are expensive, exclusive, and rigorous, combining French cultural refinement with stern Catholic discipline. School records and alumni reminiscences describe a rhythm of Mass, lessons, sports, and supervised dances that structures every day. Students wake to bells, attend morning Mass, eat breakfast in silence, attend classes taught by nuns in traditional habits, exercise under supervision, study during prescribed hours, and sleep in dormitories where even whispered conversation after lights out risks punishment. The curriculum blends French language, history, literature, and religion with deportment lessons. Letters to parents and benefactors are corrected for grammar and tone. Posture is drilled in refectory lines and chapel pews. Every aspect of appearance and behavior is subject to scrutiny and correction. The purpose is explicit: to create young women who can navigate elite society while remaining firmly grounded in Catholic faith and morality. The education is excellent. Sacred Heart alumni include writers, political figures, and social leaders, but it comes wrapped in religious and social conservatism that views women's roles as fundamentally domestic and subordinate. Students learn languages and history not to pursue independent careers, but to be suitable wives for successful Catholic men, to manage elegant households, to raise children in the faith. Kick writes home about hockey matches. She's athletic and competitive, qualities the schools encourage within proper limits, and about pranks, the small rebellions that make rigid discipline bearable. But she also writes more carefully about the pressure to be good in ways that seem to have more to do with silence than with virtue. The equation of goodness with submission, of holiness with obedience, creates an atmosphere where questioning is discouraged, where intellectual curiosity must be channeled into acceptable topics, where the most valued qualities are compliance and conformity. The tension between Kick's natural exuberance and the school's demand for restraint shapes her in complex ways. She learns to perform compliance while maintaining internal reservations, to appear obedient while quietly preserving spaces of autonomy, to navigate institutional authority through strategic conformity that conceals actual independence. The skills, learned in response to convent discipline, will later serve in managing family pressure and social expectation. Convent discipline gives her a toolkit: courtesy, resilience, a sense of duty, the ability to endure boredom and constraint without visible complaint, that will later help her manage both war work and aristocratic ritual, both of which require similar capacities for disciplined performance under observation. But it also teaches that disobedience can be internal, carried like a folded letter in a pocket, invisible to authority but present nonetheless. The lesson, perhaps unintended by the nuns who taught her, is that one can appear to conform while actually resisting, that performance and authenticity can coexist, that survival in restrictive systems requires learning which rules can be bent and which must be overtly obeyed. The religious formation, intensive and sincere, plants seeds that will later create profound conflict. Kick emerges from convent education as a practicing Catholic who attends Mass regularly, who understands Catholic theology and church teaching, who takes her faith seriously. But she also emerges as someone who has learned to distinguish between essential faith and institutional requirements, between personal relationship with God and bureaucratic religious authority, between spirituality and the specific rules that the Church uses to govern that spirituality. The distinction will matter enormously when she confronts the conflict between love and doctrine, between personal conscience and institutional prohibition. The woman who will eventually defy church teaching on mixed marriage has been educated by that same church, understands its arguments, respects its traditions, and has learned, perhaps through that very education, to recognize where obedience ends and conscience begins. By the time she arrives in London in 1938, She knows exactly how far she can push a rule without breaking it, a calculation that will define the rest of her life. The knowledge is practical and psychological. She understands institutional limits, can assess which authorities will enforce which regulations, knows how to perform compliance sufficiently to avoid immediate punishment while preserving space for actual independence. The calibration, refined through years of navigating convent discipline, becomes the strategy she applies to family pressure, church authority, and social expectation. Back in the United States after autumn 1939, with Europe at war and the Kennedy family returned to Massachusetts, Kick enrolls first at the Finch School in New York, a finishing school focused on social refinement rather than academic rigor, and later at Florida Commercial College, learning secretarial skills that upper-class women rarely needed but that wartime would make valuable. But by 1941, age 21, and restless with the aimlessness of these pursuits, she sought something more substantial. That summer, she began working at the Washington Times-Herald, a conservative newspaper owned by Eleanor Cissy Patterson. As a research assistant to executive editor Frank Waldrop, her initial assignment involves helping with a column called Did You Happen to See?, written by Inga Arvad, a Danish-born journalist whose interviews with Washington personalities attract both readers and government surveillance. Arvad's past includes a meeting with Hitler and rumors of Nazi sympathies that will eventually force her from the paper. The newsroom, located in downtown Washington in a building that hums with typewriters, ringing telephones, and shouted conversations between editors and reporters, offers Kick her first experience of professional work outside family control. The atmosphere is democratic in ways that embassy life never was. Status comes from bylines and scoops rather than lineage, and competence matters more than connections. She shares a desk with other young women, most of them not from wealthy families, all of them working seriously rather than dabbling. The newspaper's files, preserved in archives and referenced in accounts of Kennedy family history, show her byline soon appears on theater and film reviews. The assignments, minor compared to political reporting or war correspondence, nonetheless allow her to develop a public voice. She writes with the brightness that characterizes her letters, combining factual accuracy with personality, informing readers while entertaining them. The style, honed through years of thank you notes and letters home, translates effectively to journalism. She eventually takes over Arvad's column when Dane leaves the paper under pressure from FBI surveillance. The promotion, modest but meaningful, represents her first independent professional achievement, something earned through her own work rather than conferred by family status. From the shared desk in the bustling newsroom, surrounded by deadline pressure and cigarette smoke, she sends carbon copies of her pieces home to Hyannisport, where Rose annotates them with underlined praise and occasional disapproval of phrasing deemed too casual or opinions too frankly expressed. The journalism training, brief but formative, teaches skills beyond writing. She learns how to research quickly, synthesize information from multiple sources, meet deadlines, take editorial criticism, and navigate the office politics of a newsroom where competitiveness and collaboration exist in constant tension. She observes how stories are framed, how facts are selected and arranged to create particular impressions, how narrative structure shapes reader response. The education, practical and sophisticated, differs entirely from anything Sacred Heart or Finch taught. In Washington, the ritual of writing shifts. Letters are no longer just thank yous or social correspondence, but arguments, accounts, and occasionally pleas to be allowed to return to England. Her reporting voice, bright, observant, slightly irreverent, becomes a rehearsal for the way she will later narrate her own choices to skeptical parents. The column work teaches her that information can be presented in multiple ways, that tone matters as much as content, that the same facts can support different interpretations depending on emphasis and context. The Washington period, though brief, also brings her into contact with her brother Jack's circle, including his relationship with Inga Arvad that will cause family concern and FBI investigation. Kick, working alongside Arvad and aware of the scrutiny, learns practical lessons about how quickly privilege can erode under government suspicion, how fame attracts surveillance, how even the Kennedys can be vulnerable to institutions that don't defer to wealth or political connection. But primarily, Washington teaches her that she has capacities beyond social charm, that she can work effectively in professional settings, that she possesses skills marketable outside the marriage focused economy that daughters of wealthy families usually inhabit. The confidence, earned through actual competence rather than merely conferred by family name, will later help her navigate war work and make the independent decisions that eventually separate her from family expectation. Before she defies her family's wishes, she learns how stories are framed and how much can be smuggled into what seems like light copy. The lesson is about rhetoric and strategy, that serious purposes can be advanced through apparently frivolous means, that strong positions can be communicated through gentle phrasing, that defiance need not be loud to be effective. The newspaper work, focused on entertainment and personality journalism rather than hard news, nonetheless teaches structural lessons about communication, persuasion, and the manipulation of reader response that will serve her well when the audience she needs to persuade consists of her own parents and the institutional church. By June 1943, after more than 2 years of wartime America, while her brother Joe serves in the Navy and Jack recovers from injuries sustained when PT-109 was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, Kick finds an official path back to the country she still calls home in private notes to friends. The mechanism is the American Red Cross, the humanitarian organization that provides support services to American military personnel overseas and operates clubs, canteens, and recreation facilities where servicemen can rest, eat, and socialize away from military bases. She enrolls in American Red Cross courses at American University in Washington, D.C., completing training that prepares civilian volunteers for work supporting troops. The curriculum covers first aid, nutrition, recreation programming, administrative procedures, and the diplomatic skills required to work effectively with military authorities while maintaining Red Cross neutrality and humanitarian focus. She passes examinations, receives credentials, and secures assignment to London. On 25th of June 1943, she boarded ship at a New York harbor, sailing for England as a Red Cross program assistant. The crossing takes more than a week, the ship traveling in convoy for protection against U-boats zigzagging across the Atlantic under wartime routing protocols. She shares cramped quarters with other women volunteers, Red Cross workers, and nurses heading to Britain to support the massive American military buildup. The ship is blacked out at night, gun crews constantly alert, the threat of submarine attack making every day at sea tense with possibility of disaster. Her assignment upon arrival is Hans Crescent, a Red Cross club located off Knightsbridge in central London near Harrods Department Store and Hyde Park. The facility, housed in a building requisitioned for war use, offers American servicemen food, recreation, letter-writing facilities, and a space that feels temporarily like home. The Kennedy family collection at the JFK Library holds photographs of her in Red Cross uniform there, smiling at a canteen counter, a stack of forms at her elbow, surrounded by the institutional orderliness that war imposes on humanitarian work. The work is simultaneously bureaucratic and intimate. She manages supplies, schedules activities, coordinates with military chaplains and medical services, handles logistics that keep the club functioning. But she also talks with individual soldiers, listens to their stories, writes letters for men whose injuries make writing difficult, and provides the kind of sympathetic attention that military institutions focused on efficiency and discipline cannot offer. In off hours, she sits in a corner of the common room, answering letters from home and from young men overseas, including her brothers and various Kennedy family friends in military service. Her replies, preserved in some collections and referenced in biographies, are efficient, affectionate, rarely sentimental, a bureaucratic kindness shaped by the scale of war. She cannot be emotionally overwhelmed by every tragic story, or she would be unable to function. She learns to care while maintaining professional distance, to sympathize without drowning in the sorrow that war creates in such abundance. London in 1943 bears little resemblance to the glittering city of her debutante season. The Blitz has damaged or destroyed much of the city. Rationing makes food scarce and monotonous. Blackout regulations plunge streets into darkness after sunset. Bombed buildings create gaps in once continuous streetscapes. The population lives with constant awareness that air raids could resume at any time. The Americans, arriving in increasing numbers as the buildup for invasion intensifies, bring energy and confidence, but also strain resources and create social tensions. Yet for Kick, the city remains home in ways that America never quite was. She knows the streets, understands the social codes, has friendships that predate the war. She navigates bombed neighborhoods with the ease of someone who belongs, who understands not just geography, but the emotional landscape of a city under siege. The return, officially for Red Cross service, is also personal restoration, a reclamation of the life that war and parental authority had interrupted. The Red Cross role is public service, providing genuine value to servicemen far from home and facing combat that will kill many of them. But it is also personal emancipation, a way to be in London on her own terms, under a different authority than her father's. She wears the Red Cross uniform rather than embassy gowns. She works rather than attends parties. She serves rather than being served. The transformation from ambassador's daughter to war worker inverts her previous position in ways that feel like liberation. The return address on her letters is no longer Embassy London, but American Red Cross, Hans Crescent, a small, bureaucratic shift with enormous emotional weight. The change signifies independence, adult identity separate from family position, legitimate presence in London that cannot be easily terminated by parental decision. She has found a role that justifies remaining in England, that serves useful purpose, that allows her to reconstruct the life war had interrupted 4 years earlier. In late 1943, in wartime London, where American servicemen crowd streets and pubs, where rationing makes restaurants serve thin meals on thinning china, where air raid sirens occasionally still send people rushing to shelters, Kick and Billy Cavendish meet again. He is now an officer in the Coldstream Guards, one of Britain's elite infantry regiments, home on leave from training. She is the ebullient American Red Cross worker at Hans Crescent, dispensing coffee and conversation to soldiers far from home. The reunion, 5 years after their first meetings in 1938, rapidly intensifies into something far more serious than their pre-war courtship. According to accounts preserved in the Chatsworth estate archives and referenced in biographies, their wartime friendship rapidly ripens into serious romance, rekindling the connection begun before war separated them. The context shapes everything. Both are older, more mature, aware that war makes time precious and future uncertain. Billy has already seen combat, lost friends, and understands that his survival is not guaranteed. Kick has worked long enough at Hans Crescent to know how many men die, how casualty lists arrive with bureaucratic regularity, and how quickly life can end. They attend small dinners at the homes of friends who have survived the Blitz, charity events that raise funds for war relief, and church services. His Anglican, hers Catholic, the denominational difference visible every Sunday when they worship separately. He visits the Red Cross Club, sitting at corner tables drinking bad coffee while she finishes her shift, waiting with the patience that his class and temperament make natural. Friends recall letters exchanged when he is back with his unit, notes that combine affectionate teasing with sober reflections on casualty lists and air raids. The tone balancing intimacy with the restraint that both class and wartime necessity require. The romance develops under conditions entirely different from their pre-war courtship. Then they met at garden parties and regattas, surrounded by servants and chaperones, observed by society columnists tracking aristocratic marriage prospects. Now they meet in bomb-damaged London, in Red Cross canteens and military clubs, in a city where death is commonplace and social conventions have loosened under wartime exigency. The transformation affects how they relate. Less formal, more direct, accelerated by awareness that time may be short. Billy, in letters to friends quoted in later accounts, describes Kick with admiration that goes beyond mere attraction. He values her intelligence, her competence, her American directness that cuts through British reserve. She challenges him intellectually, makes him laugh, brings energy and optimism to a world darkened by war. He recognizes that she is exceptional, not merely as a pretty American girl, but as a person of genuine substance and character. For Kick, Billy represents emotional and intellectual partnership that she has not found elsewhere. He treats her as an equal despite the gender norms that make such treatment rare. He respects her work and opinions. He sees her as herself rather than as Kennedy daughter or potential trophy wife. The relationship, while grounded in physical attraction, seems primarily based on mutual respect and complementary temperaments that create genuine friendship alongside romantic love. Rose Kennedy, reading Transatlantic Mail in Hyannisport, is appalled. Her daughter, a Catholic, is seriously involved with an Anglican heir whose future children, as heirs to a dukedom, would certainly be raised in the Church of England. The theological implications are clear. Mixed marriage is problematic under Catholic teaching. Worse, a marriage where children are raised. Protestant represents apostasy, a betrayal of faith that endangers immortal souls. Biographies record Rose's attempts to block the match through every available means. She writes letters directly to Kick, appealing to faith, family loyalty, and maternal authority. She appeals to priests, seeking their intervention in theological arguments that might persuade her daughter. She appeals to Joe, urging him to use paternal authority and financial control to prevent the marriage. She contacts Catholic officials in London, hoping they can counsel Kick against the match. The campaign, conducted through letters and transatlantic telephone calls, represents Rose's desperate attempt to prevent what she views as spiritual disaster. Joe, pragmatic where Rose is doctrinal, worries less about theology than about politics. His political ambitions, always present, include the possibility that one of his sons might seek office, and a daughter married to a Protestant aristocrat could complicate appeals to Irish Catholic voters who remain suspicious of Protestant elites. The calculation, cynical but realistic, adds political concern to Rose's religious objections. Kick continues to write, each letter home more carefully worded, each omission deliberate. She emphasizes Billy's character and her own happiness while minimizing the religious conflict. She frames the relationship as natural development of feelings that began years earlier, as inevitable recognition of compatibility that war has made urgent. She appeals to family values, arguing that Billy treats her well and would be a good husband, hoping that parental love might override doctrinal concerns. But the letters, however skillful, cannot bridge the gap between competing imperatives. Rose will not compromise on faith. Kick will not abandon Billy. Every new page she posts to Massachusetts makes the distance between the girl in the convent and the woman in London slightly irreversibly wider. The correspondence, once a ritual of family connection, becomes a site of irreconcilable conflict where grace and eloquence cannot disguise fundamental incompatibility between duty and desire. In early 1944, as Allied forces prepare for D-Day invasion, and London fills with troops training for the assault on Fortress Europe, the question of marriage forces the conflict into the open, demanding resolution that letters and omissions can no longer defer. To wed Billy in a way that might satisfy both Catholic Church and British aristocratic expectations, Kick seeks a Catholic dispensation that would allow a mixed marriage provided children are raised Catholic, a compromise that would preserve her standing with the Church while allowing marriage to the man she loves. The process is complex and bureaucratic. She consults with Catholic chaplains in London, submits formal applications through proper church channels, makes her case in writing and in person to religious authorities who must weigh individual desire against institutional doctrine. The arguments are theological and practical. She is a practicing Catholic whose faith is sincere. Billy is a decent man whose Anglicanism reflects family tradition rather than anti-Catholic animus. Their children could be raised with knowledge of both traditions even if formally Catholic. The marriage, blessed by church, would be stronger than one conducted in defiance of church teaching. Billy, heir to the dukedom with responsibilities to his family's history and England's social structure, cannot agree to Catholic upbringing for his children. The objection is not personal, but institutional. The Duke of Devonshire, head of one of England's premier aristocratic families, must be Anglican. Chatsworth, filled with Protestant history and Anglican chaplains, cannot be home to Catholic heirs. The family's position in British society, built over centuries, depends partly on religious conformity. For Billy to agree to raise children, Catholic would betray not just his own family, but the entire social system he represents. Vatican records and later historians note that the dispensation was refused. The Church, applying rules that govern mixed marriages, determines that the situation does not meet requirements for exception. Without guarantee that children will be raised Catholic, the marriage cannot receive church sanction. The ruling, bureaucratic and impersonal, reflects institutional logic that subordinates individual happiness to doctrinal consistency and ecclesiastical authority. Rose's letters, referenced in family biographies and occasionally quoted in Kennedy historical accounts, warn that if Kathleen marries outside the church and allows her children to be Anglicans, she risks her soul and her relationship with her mother. The phrasing is stark. This is not merely parental disapproval, but theological judgment. Rose believes, with absolute certainty, that Kick's immortal soul is endangered by marriage outside church sanction, that the choice is literally between salvation and damnation, that no earthly happiness justifies spiritual peril. The emotional cost to Rose is genuine. She loves her daughter, but loves God more. She wants Kick's happiness, but believes true happiness requires obedience to church teaching. She faces the impossible choice between accepting what she views as her daughter's apostasy or maintaining principles that define her entire life. The conflict, though often presented as cold dogmatism, actually involves real suffering by someone who cannot separate love from faith, who cannot imagine sanctioning what she believes endangers her child eternally. Joe, visiting London briefly on business that may or may not be officially diplomatic, urges delay. The advice is characteristically pragmatic. Wait until after the war, when emotions are less intense and circumstances clearer. Don't make irreversible decisions under wartime pressure. Reconsider when Billy's survival is certain rather than probable. The counsel, though framed as wisdom, actually serves to prevent the marriage without directly forbidding it, allowing Joe to appear reasonable while achieving the same result Rose pursues more directly. Kick, now working long hours at Hans Crescent while managing emotional warfare conducted through transatlantic mail, writes back on Red Cross stationery, the institutional letterhead lending official quality to personal arguments. She insists that her conscience is clear, that Billy's decency matters more than denominational lines, that faith is about relationship with God rather than institutional obedience, that the Church's ruling, however official, does not determine moral truth. The arguments, sophisticated and heartfelt, represent theological reasoning by someone who has thought deeply about doctrine rather than merely accepting received teaching. The pen that once framed thank you notes now drafts theological arguments in tidy blue ink. The handwriting is careful as ever. The courtesy is perfect, but the content revolutionary. She is claiming authority over her own spiritual life, asserting that personal conscience can legitimately override institutional prohibition, arguing that love can be holy even when unsanctioned by bureaucracy. The position, while not unique, many Catholics before her have made similar claims, represents a radical break from the obedience that Rose and Catholic education have always demanded. Refinement has become a tool of resistance. She never raises her voice, but every carefully composed letter loosens another thread in the fabric of her upbringing. The letters maintain perfect form, correct salutations, gracious phrases, expressions of filial affection, while their substance systematically dismantles the authority structure that form is supposed to serve. She is using the tools of obedience to assert disobedience, deploying courtesy as a weapon, making grace itself a mode of defiance. The correspondence through early 1944 shows increasing clarity on both sides. Rose will not compromise. Church will not grant dispensation. Joe will not openly support the marriage. Kick, understanding that permission will never come, faces the choice that has been implicit since 1943. Obey or defy, submit or proceed, remain daughter or become herself. When the Church says no and her parents say, wait, she quietly chooses a third answer, Now, the decision, once made, becomes inevitable. All that remains is execution. On 6 May 1944, in Caxton Hall Register Office, Westminster, a modest civic building where Londoners marry when churches are unavailable or inappropriate, Kathleen Kennedy and William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, marry in a brief civil ceremony. The choice of venue is significant. A register office, rather than a church, signals that this is legal marriage without religious sanction. Civil contract rather than sacramental union, a solution that satisfies legal requirements while acknowledging religious impasse. Contemporary newspaper notices, preserved in archives and quoted in biographies, record that only one Kennedy is present, her brother, Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., in naval uniform, who escorts her and serves as witness. Joe Jr.'s presence, noted by journalists and later historians, represents complex family dynamics. He is the oldest son, the golden child for whom a great political future has been planned, yet he defies parental wishes to support his sister. His attendance is both loyalty to Kick and a subtle rebellion against parental authority that he too finds sometimes oppressive. There is no white dress, no nuptial mass, no rose, no celebration that normally accompanies Kennedy family events. Instead, there is a registrar reading legal formulae, a handful of friends including Billy's sister, Lady Anne Cavendish, and a few other witnesses, and the knowledge that in Boston the marriage will be spoken of in lowered voices as tragedy and betrayal. The contrast with the elaborate Catholic weddings that Rose envisions for her daughters could not be starker. No pageantry, no blessing, no public celebration, only quiet acknowledgement of decisions made in defiance of family and church. The ceremony lasts minutes. They exchange vows, sign a registry, and receive a certificate that makes them legally married under British law. The efficiency, while emotionally anticlimactic, achieves what months of negotiation could not. It makes them married despite institutional obstacles, creates legal fact that cannot be undone by disapproval or theological argument. The civil marriage, while lacking religious sanction, possesses full legal validity. Afterward, over a simple lunch at a nearby restaurant where wartime rationing means limited menu and sparse portions, Kathleen writes quick notes, one to Joe Sr. in America, one to a London girlfriend, others to various family members, announcing that she is now Marchioness of Hartington. Copies of these letters, quoted in biographies, convey a mixture of joy and apprehension. She is happy to be married to Billy, relieved that decision has been made and executed, but also aware of the cost, her mother's approval, her standing in the church, her uncomplicated position in the family. By choosing this path, she gains a title that makes her Lady Hartington and future Duchess of Devonshire, a new family that accepts her despite religious difference, and a foothold in the England she loves more than any other place. She also enters a liminal space, too Protestant a match for her mother and Catholic community, too American a marchioness for some in the English aristocracy who view transatlantic marriages skeptically, too unconventional for comfortable position in either society. The mail that arrives from Massachusetts in subsequent weeks carries Rose's pain and anger. The letters, described in various family accounts, though not fully published, express betrayal, disappointment, and genuine fear for Kick's spiritual welfare. Rose has lost control of her daughter's moral life. Worse, she believes Kick has chosen temporal happiness over eternal salvation, has valued earthly love over divine law, and has abandoned faith for romance. The accusation, while framed theologically, also reflects maternal hurt. Rose, who has devoted her life to raising children according to strict religious and social principles, sees that devotion rejected by the daughter she particularly loved. The extended family divides in response. Some Kennedy relatives, particularly those less rigidly orthodox than Rose, quietly approve or at least accept Kick's choice. Others, especially those most invested in maintaining Catholic identity against Protestant discrimination, view the marriage as betrayal of community and heritage. The Fitzgeralds, Rose's family, are particularly troubled. Honey Fitz, the legendary Boston mayor and Irish Catholic politician, has always emphasized ethnic and religious solidarity and Kick's marriage to Protestant aristocracy seems to reject everything he represents. In 7 minutes at Caxton Hall, she becomes both the triumph and the scandal of the Kennedy daughters. The formulation captures the contradiction. She has married brilliantly by worldly standards, becoming Marchioness and future Duchess, achieving a social position that money alone cannot buy. But she has married disastrously by religious standards, entering union without church blessing, committing to raising children outside the faith, accepting spiritual consequences that Catholic teaching presents as grave and eternal. The wedding photographs, preserved in various collections and occasionally reproduced in books about the Kennedy family, show a young woman in a simple suit, hatless, standing beside a man in military uniform, both looking serious rather than joyful. Aware that what they have done, though desired, carries costs neither will escape. The images lack the romance of conventional wedding pictures. Instead, they document what happens when love collides with institutional authority, when individual desire confronts family expectation, when the choice is made to proceed despite opposition from nearly every source of power. In the weeks after 6 May 1944, as spring turns to early summer and the Allied invasion of Normandy approaches with obvious inevitability, evident in the massive military buildup consuming southern England, Kick divides her time between London Red Cross work and visits to Derbyshire, learning the duties of a future Duchess alongside her new mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess, and her sister-in-law, Deborah Debo Cavendish, née Mitford. Debo, married to Billy's younger brother Andrew Cavendish, will become one of Kick's closest friends, a relationship preserved in letters and later reminiscences. The Cavendish family, accepting Kick despite religious difference, welcomes her with warmth that contrasts sharply with Kennedy family coldness. The Duchess, while undoubtedly preferring that her heir marry within the Anglican faith, treats Kick with courtesy and affection, recognizing that Billy has chosen well, even if unconventionally. The acceptance, significant given aristocratic emphasis on lineage and religious continuity, reflects both the family's genuine kindness and Billy's obvious happiness in the marriage. Kick works at village fairs in Derbyshire, participates in war relief fundraising, signs raffle books, and speaks to local organizations as Kathleen Hartington. The work, mundane but meaningful, introduces her to the responsibilities that come with aristocratic position. A duchess is not merely an ornament, but a working figure in rural communities, expected to support local institutions, open village events, contribute to charity, and maintain connection between the great house and surrounding population. The role, while privileged, carries genuine obligations that require time, attention, and sincere engagement with people whose lives differ vastly from hers. A joint wartime diary kept by the couple, excerpted in later accounts and quoted in biographies, records a bittersweet awareness that their happiness is fragile and time together precious. They write about small domestic details, walks in Chatsworth Gardens, quiet dinners, conversations about future after the war, but also about the shadow that military service casts over everything. Billy must return to his regiment. The invasion is imminent. Combat will follow. His survival is hoped for, but cannot be assumed. On 6 June 1944, as planes drone overhead carrying paratroopers toward Normandy beaches, and the invasion that will determine war's outcome finally begins, Billy notes in the diary that their love seems to cause nothing but goodbyes. The line, poignant in its understatement and very British in its refusal of melodrama, captures the reality of wartime marriage, the constant separations, the awareness that each goodbye might be final, the tension between hoping for the future and accepting the present. By September 1944, Billy was in Belgium with the Coldstream Guards, part of the Allied forces advancing through France and Low Countries after breaking out of Normandy beachheads. The fighting, though moving forward, remains intense. German forces resist in prepared positions. Casualties continue despite Allied momentum. 4 months after their wedding, on 10 September 1944, Billy was killed by German sniper fire near Heppen in Belgium, aged 26. Army records and obituaries in British papers mark the loss of the Duke of Devonshire's heir. noting his military service and premature death. A telegram bearing the news reaches Kathleen in London, delivered by military messenger to her Red Cross quarters. The format is standard, War Office regrets to inform. The words bureaucratically precise, the impact devastating. For once, she does not answer immediately. The rituals of correspondence, performed so reliably throughout her life, feel inadequate to what war has taken. What words exist that can respond to this? What formula captures the loss? The pen that has drafted thank yous, arguments, love letters, theological defenses, now confronts limits of language itself. The grief, though private, is also public. British newspapers carry obituaries noting Billy's death and his recent marriage to Ambassador Kennedy's daughter. The coverage, while respectful, revives the religious controversy. She is a young widow of Protestant heir, having married outside church sanction, now facing consequences that some view as divine judgment, while others see as tragic randomness of war. The interpretations, competing and irreconcilable, surround her mourning with theological argument. Rose's response, referenced in various accounts, though the actual letter has not been published, is complex. She grieves for her daughter's loss, understands the pain of widowhood, and wants to offer comfort, but she also cannot help viewing Billy's death through theological lens. The marriage was wrong. Perhaps this is providence preventing worse error. Perhaps now Kick will return to church and family. The interpretation, though undoubtedly sincere, adds spiritual burden to emotional devastation, implies that loss carries meaning rather than being merely a senseless tragedy of war. At 24, she is a widow and a dowager marchioness, trapped between families that never entirely accepted the marriage that made her both. The Cavendishes mourn Billy but welcome her continued presence. The Kennedys mourn Billy's death but hope it will end Kick's English connection. She belongs fully to neither family, the marriage having created an identity that survives Billy's death but finds no comfortable position in either America or England. The widowhood, which might seem to resolve the conflict between families, actually intensifies her liminal status. Too much a Cavendish for a comfortable return to the Kennedy family. Too much a Kennedy to become simply an English aristocrat. In the late 1940s, with war over, but its aftermath defining post-war Europe, Kick remains in England as Dowager Marchioness of Hartington, keeping her title despite Billy's death, but no longer positioned to become Duchess of Devonshire, since that role passes to Andrew Cavendish upon his father's eventual death. She rebuilds a social life in London and the Shires, moving between the city's artistic and aristocratic circles and the country houses where her title and connections ensure invitations. She remains close to the Cavendish family, particularly Debo, who will eventually become Duchess of Devonshire herself, but her name begins to appear in gossip columns in connection with William Peter Fitzwilliam, 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, a wealthy, charming aristocrat who owns Wentworth Woodhouse, one of England's largest private houses, and possesses income from coal mining and vast estates. Fitzwilliam, born in 1910, is then separated but not divorced from his wife, Olive Dorothea Plunkett. The distinction matters enormously in both Catholic teaching and English law. Separation is legal but leaves marriage intact. Divorce, while permitted under English law since the 19th century, remains difficult and socially problematic. Remarriage during the lifetime of a previous spouse is forbidden under Catholic teaching, regardless of civil law. Accounts from the National Park Service digital archives and later biographies describe a serious love affair rather than casual relationship. They are seen together at restaurants, nightclubs, and house parties. They travel together on the continent. Friends describe genuine attachment and mutual affection. For Kick, the relationship represents renewed possibility of happiness after Billy's death, the chance to rebuild life around new love while remaining in England, where she feels most at home. But the relationship is even more problematic than her marriage to Billy had been. At least Billy was unmarried. Fitzwilliam's wife, though separated, remains alive, making him indisputably married under Catholic teaching. For Kick to marry, Fitzwilliam would not merely violate rules about mixed marriages, It would involve what the church considers adultery and bigamy, marriage to someone whose sacramental union to another person remains valid regardless of civil separation or divorce. She writes to her father in spring 1948, hoping he will agree to meet them and, perhaps, sanction a second marriage that would again violate Catholic teaching. The letter, its contents referenced in biographies, though apparently not preserved or at least not publicly available, must have been difficult to write. How to ask father for approval, knowing that approval means defying mother and church. How to frame the request when the answer will almost certainly be negative. The composition must have required all the epistolary skills she had accumulated over decades, all the rhetorical sophistication learned through journalism and correspondence. Joe's response, to the extent it can be reconstructed from later accounts, is ambiguous. Some sources suggest he was willing to meet them, to at least discuss the situation, to perhaps find some compromise. Others suggest he remained opposed but hoped that meeting in person might allow him to dissuade Kick from proceeding. The ambiguity itself is revealing. Joe, pragmatic and less doctrinally rigid than Rose, occupies middle ground between absolute prohibition and acceptance, wanting to maintain a relationship with his daughter while not endorsing what he knows will cause a family crisis. Rose is again implacable. According to family sources and biographers, she warns that Kathleen will be cut off financially and emotionally if she marries a divorced man whose first wife is still living. The threat, while painful, is also predictable. Rose has already demonstrated willingness to sacrifice a relationship with Kick rather than compromise on faith. The marriage to Billy, at least initially, had produced estrangement. Marriage to Fitzwilliam would produce permanent rupture. Kick continues to write, drafting letters that balance filial affection with determination to pursue her own happiness despite family opposition. The habit of polite argument, honed in convent school, refined at the Times Herald, tested during the first marriage crisis, now serves a more radical aim: to claim a life she knows will never be fully respectable in the eyes of her church or her clan. The letters, meticulously composed, demonstrate that she has learned all the lessons her education provided and has chosen to apply them toward purposes that education was meant to prevent. The correspondence through early 1948 shows her articulating a position that, while not formally theological, represents sophisticated moral reasoning. She argues that happiness matters, that love is valuable in itself, that institutional rules cannot encompass all circumstances, that personal conscience legitimately guides decisions that institutions claim authority over. The arguments, though framed as personal appeals to family, actually constitute a philosophical position about the limits of institutional authority and the sovereignty of individual moral judgment. Her first marriage cost her her mother's blessing. The second may cost her the family entirely, and she chooses to pursue it anyway. The progression is significant. The first marriage was difficult but eventually produced partial reconciliation after Billy's death. The second marriage, if it occurred, would likely have produced permanent estrangement. Yet she moves forward, indicating that by 1948 she has reached a point where family approval, while desired, is not required for her to proceed with decisions she believes are right. On the afternoon of 13th May 1948, Kathleen boarded a de Havilland DH-104 Dove, a small twin-engine aircraft designed for private charter and short-range passenger service at Le Bourget Airport in Paris. She is traveling with Earl Fitzwilliam, his pilot, Peter Townsend, not the royal equerry of the same name, but a private aviator, and Townsend's navigator. Aviation Safety Network records show the aircraft leaving Croydon Airport in London earlier that day, stopping in Paris briefly, then departing around 3:30 p.m. for Cannes on the French Riviera. Some accounts suggest they intend to meet Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. in the south of France to discuss their future and possibly secure his support for marriage, though the exact purpose of the trip remains somewhat unclear in historical record. The National Park Service archives note their hope of securing Joe's support, the meeting representing one more attempt to bridge the gap between personal desire and family expectation, to find some way forward that does not require complete rupture with family. The flight plan calls for crossing central France, flying over the massif Central Mountains toward the Mediterranean coast. The route, while direct, requires navigating mountainous terrain where weather can change rapidly and where small aircraft face particular hazards. The de Havilland Dove, while reliable for its era, lacks the instruments and power of larger aircraft, making it vulnerable to storms and turbulence. The plane never arrives at its destination. Caught in severe storms over the Ardèche region of south-central France, with visibility near zero and winds buffeting the small aircraft, it crashes into wooded slopes near the village of Saint-Beauzile. The impact is catastrophic. All four aboard are killed instantly. French police reports and accident summaries compiled by aviation safety investigators describe wreckage scattered among trees on a mountainside, the aircraft destroyed beyond recognition. Personal papers and belongings charred, but partially legible among debris. Somewhere in that debris lay whatever letter she had prepared for her father. One more attempt to persuade him that love could outrun scandal, that personal happiness justified defying institutional prohibition, that she could be both Kennedy and herself. The letter, if it existed and has been recovered, remains unpublished. If it burned in the crash, its arguments are lost. Either way, the final attempt at persuasion through carefully crafted words ends in silence. She is 28 years old, having lived more intensely in those years than many do in far longer lives. From Boston debutante to London sensation, to wartime Red Cross worker, to marchioness, to widow, to dowager, to woman in love again. The progression compressed into a decade, each transformation requiring adaptation, each stage presenting new conflicts between expectation and desire. The news reaches various destinations over the following hours and days. In London, friends learn through press reports and official notifications. At Chatsworth, the Cavendish family mourns the loss of someone who had become part of their family despite the brief marriage. In Massachusetts, the Kennedy family receives word through official channels, probably State Department notification to Ambassador Kennedy, though he no longer holds that title. Rose's response, when it eventually becomes known, reflects her theological framework. Some accounts suggest she viewed the crash as providence preventing worse error, as divine intervention stopping Kick from committing what Rose viewed as greater sin. The interpretation, harsh to modern sensibilities, was consistent with Rose's understanding of God's active role in human affairs and her belief that temporal suffering, however painful, matters less than eternal consequences. Whether she said this explicitly or whether it was inferred from her actions and statements remains disputed among Kennedy biographers. Joe's response seems to have been one of grief unmodified by theological interpretation. He had loved Kick specially, had enjoyed her company, and had perhaps understood her better than Rose could. The death of his favorite daughter, coming after Joe Jr.'s death in 1944 when his bomber exploded during a volunteer mission, represents the second profound loss of children he particularly valued. The accumulation of grief, Joe Jr. dead, Kick dead, his political ambitions increasingly transferred to sons who remain, shapes the last decades of his life. The woman whose life had been shaped by departures, leaving America for England in 1938, leaving England for America in 1939, leaving America for England in 1943, leaving Massachusetts for London repeatedly, dies mid-journey, between the country she chose and the family she hoped might still choose her back. The crash, occurring in France rather than England or America, leaves her literally suspended between the two places that defined her identity, belonging fully to neither, claimed by both, at rest in neither. The physical location of death, French mountainside rather than English estate or American compound, mirrors her emotional and social position. Caught between competing claims, unable to satisfy both, destroyed by the attempt to bridge incompatible worlds. The mountains that killed her become a metaphor for the immovable obstacles she confronted throughout adult life, the institutional forces, family, church, social expectation, that she could maneuver around but never quite overcome. After the crash, there is no large Kennedy funeral in Massachusetts, no Boston ceremony where the Irish Catholic community mourns one of their most prominent daughters, no public ritual of the sort that usually marks Kennedy family losses. Instead, Kathleen is buried in England, not in America, at St. Peter's Church in Edensor, a small village on the Chatsworth estate near the great house where she would have become Duchess of Devonshire had Billy survived the war. The decision, made by the Cavendish family in consultation with whatever Kennedy representatives were involved, recognizes that her life had become more English than American, that her marriage to Billy, though brief, had created bonds and identity that death did not entirely sever. Her headstone, shared with Billy in memorial, though their bodies are buried separately, records simply Kathleen Cavendish, Marchioness of Hartington, 1920-1948. The inscription, spare and factual, gives her married name and title, not her Kennedy identity. The choice is significant. She is remembered as what she became, not what she was born. The stone acknowledges the marriage that caused so much conflict, the identity she fought to claim, the English life she chose despite everything it cost. Within the Kennedy clan, her story becomes quieter, less prominent in the family mythology that emphasizes ambition, public service, and political achievement. Biographers and family commentators note Rose's discomfort with both her marriages and her death, alongside a married man. The circumstances too problematic to be easily incorporated into the narrative of Kennedy excellence. Later retellings, while acknowledging Kick's existence, often minimize her story's centrality, presenting her as a tragic footnote rather than central figure. Some accounts suggest an unspoken decision not to foreground her in the family mythology that develops as Jack Kennedy pursues presidency in the late 1950s and becomes president in 1961. A sister who defied church teaching, married outside the faith, and died with a divorced man while apparently planning to marry him. This complicates the image of devout Catholic family, creates questions about religious commitment, potentially undermines the narrative of Kennedy piety that Rose particularly cultivates. Yet the archives will not be forgotten. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum preserves her wartime Red Cross photographs, showing her in uniform at Hans Crescent, smiling amid the organized chaos of military recreation support. The archives hold stacks of letters, from London to Massachusetts, from Washington to Hyannisport, from Chatsworth to New York, the correspondence that documents her internal life and strategic thinking across crucial years. At Kennedy Family Museums in Massachusetts and in recent historical profiles, scholars quote Joe's fond line, "Kick was especially special," and describe her as the closest thing America had to a princess, acknowledging her significance even as official family narrative minimizes it. In 1963, 15 years after her death, President John F. Kennedy made a quiet visit to her grave at Edensor during a European trip. The visit, unannounced to the press but mentioned in British and American coverage decades later, represents a brother paying respect to a life that would not fit the script their parents had written. Jack, who had shared some of Kick's rebellious spirit and who understood the constraints of being Kennedy, makes the pilgrimage privately, acknowledging the sister who chose differently and paid accordingly. The contrast between public Kennedy narrative and private Kennedy reality, always present in the family, becomes particularly visible in Kick's story. Publicly, the Kennedys represent Catholic piety, family unity, political ambition channeled toward public service. Privately, the family contains profound conflicts between faith and desire, between institutional loyalty and personal autonomy, between being Kennedy and being oneself. Kick's life, precisely because it ended tragically while pursuing the second forbidden marriage, makes those conflicts visible in ways that successful conformity or quiet rebellion would not. The grave at Edensor, tended by Chatsworth staff and visited by tourists interested in Kennedy history or British aristocratic connections, represents a geographical compromise between competing claims. She rests in England, the country she chose, but under a marker that acknowledges her American identity through the dates that frame a life lived intensely between two worlds. The location, on a great estate, near a house that represents centuries of British aristocratic tradition, testifies to how completely she had been accepted by the Cavendishes, how genuine their affection was, how much they valued her, despite the complications her presence created. Today, those who search the records find two parallel Kathleens: the dutiful Catholic daughter Rose tried to shape, and the English Marchioness she actually became, joined only where her handwriting survives. The letters, preserved in climate-controlled archives and occasionally quoted in biographies, show someone learning to assert autonomy through the very medium that was supposed to train obedience, someone using the tools of refinement to pursue defiance, someone whose grace on paper concealed steel in character. The writing, elegant and careful to the end, documents a life spent negotiating between competing loyalties, a tragedy of irreconcilable obligations, and a determination to choose authenticity over approval, even when the cost proved fatal. In a quiet reading room at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, situated on Columbia Point overlooking the harbor where her grandfather Honey Fitz once dominated city politics, an archivist lays a thin folder on foam supports, handling it with the careful reverence that archivists bring to fragile historical documents. Inside is a letter from Kathleen Kennedy in London, dated 1944, written on American Red Cross stationery, the institutional letterhead lending official quality to deeply personal content. The ink, originally blue-black, has faded to a soft brown. The paper has developed the slight brittleness that afflicts documents decades old, but the handwriting remains clear, the script as careful and elegant as Rose Kennedy's training demanded. The sentences move with the same light, confident rhythm she once used for thank you notes after embassy balls and movie reviews in Washington, the style that made her journalism readable and her correspondence charming. But the subject is heavier than film criticism or social pleasantries. War, love, conscience, the irreconcilable conflict between duty to family and truth to self. She apologizes for worrying her parents, acknowledges that her choices caused them pain, affirms her affection for them and her understanding of their concerns. But then, without drama or raised voice, she states that she must follow the path she believes is right. The phrasing is neither defiant nor apologetic, but simply declarative. This is what I must do. The statement, revolutionary in its implications despite its measured tone, asserts sovereignty over her own life, claims authority over her own conscience, declares that parental disapproval and church prohibition, while noted and even regretted, do not finally govern her decisions. The archivist smooths the creased page back into its archival sleeve, adds a note to the folder's contents list, and returns it to proper storage. The letter will wait there, along with thousands of other documents from Kennedy family history, for the next researcher who comes seeking to understand what happened to the daughter who would not conform, who loved wrong men by right standards, who chose England over America and authenticity over approval. Somewhere in Derbyshire, rain falls on the stone that bears her married name, the ancient weathering of English climate slowly softening the inscription that marks her resting place. The churchyard at Edensor, surrounded by the estate that would have been partly hers had Billy survived, receives regular visitors, tourists interested in Kennedy history, researchers studying transatlantic marriages and wartime relationships, Americans seeking connections to the president's family, British locals maintaining the estate's historical significance. In Brookline, tourists walk past the house where she was born, the modest brick building at 83 Beale Street, now maintained as a National Historic Site commemorating John F. Kennedy's birthplace. The tours mention Kick briefly, noting her as one of 9 Kennedy children, perhaps mentioning her marriage to the Marquis of Hartington, usually omitting the religious conflict and the second forbidden romance. The sanitized version, appropriate for public presentation, erases the conflict that defined her adult life. On the paper preserved in Boston, her signature ends in a small upward flick, the pen lifting off the page mid-stroke as if refusing to descend into finality. The gesture is the same as on that London night in May 1938, when she wrote thank you notes after Queen Charlotte's ball. The same fluid motion practiced until it became automatic. But now we can see the cost carried in its curve, and can recognize that the graceful upward movement conceals the weight of defying everyone she was supposed to obey. The archival preservation ensures that her words survive even as memory fades, that researchers can reconstruct her thinking and follow her reasoning, that her voice remains audible across decades despite efforts to quiet it. The letters, artifacts of a particular historical moment, also speak to permanent tensions between individual autonomy and institutional authority, between personal desire and family obligation, between the heart's truth and society's demands. The story that began with a girl learning to write polite notes in Brookline kitchens ends with those notes preserved as historical evidence, proof of a life lived at the intersection of privilege and constraint, of someone who learned all the lessons her class and gender required, and then carefully, deliberately chose to apply them toward purposes those lessons were meant to prevent. The elegance remained to the end. The obedience did not. The grace that was supposed to make her marriageable and manageable instead made her defiance all the more powerful, all the more difficult to dismiss as mere rebellion. The pen, lifted in that upward flick, never completed the motion that would close the letter conventionally. Instead, it stopped mid-flight, leaving the signature open-ended, refusing closure, gesturing toward a future that war and weather and a French mountain ended before she could write it. The incompleteness, accidental or deliberate, becomes the final statement, a life interrupted, a story unfinished, a trajectory terminated before its destination. The letter, preserved but incomplete, joins the grave in England and the archive in Boston as markers of someone who existed between worlds, claimed by both but belonging entirely to neither, remembered imperfectly by both but forgotten by neither.